Welcome. Find a comfortable place to rest, somewhere you feel safe and warm. Tonight, we journey back through time to the American frontier of the 1840s and 1850s, period of mass migration, impossible dreams, and extraordinary hardship. But do not worry. You are here, in the present, in comfort and safety. What follows is simply a story, a gentle exploration of lives lived long ago. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the known world, looking westward across 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain. Thousands of ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers made this journey, driven by economic desperation and the promise of free land in Oregon or riches in California. Most had never slept outdoors in their lives. Most had never walked more than a few miles in a single day. Yet they would walk halfway across a continent, bearing loved ones along the way, enduring privations we can scarcely imagine from our warm beds tonight. Over the next hours, we will walk with them. We will feel the dust of the trail, taste the monotony of their meals, and witness the slow, grinding exhaustion that defined their days. We will follow the rush of gold seekers to California, explore the silent remnants they left behind, and finally enter the instant metropolis of San Francisco, where fortunes were made by those who never touched a gold pan. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink deeper into rest. The past cannot harm you. You are simply listening, drifting, as history unfolds in a gentle, steady rhythm. Let us begin. It is April in Independence, Missouri, and the town teems with nervous energy. Hundreds of families have converged here, at the edge of civilization, preparing for a journey that will consume the next 6 months of their lives. You are one of them. Perhaps you are a farmer from Ohio, driven west by the economic collapse of 1837 that left you unable to sell your crops for what they cost to grow. Perhaps you are a shopkeeper whose business failed, or a laborer who could find no work. The Depression has been merciless, and the promise of free land in Oregon's 640 acres for a married couple represents your last, best hope. Your wagon sits heavy with supplies. You have spent months preparing, purchasing the provisions guidebooks insist are necessary for the crossing. Flour, 200 pounds of it, packed in barrels. Bacon, another 200 pounds, smoked and wrapped. Beans, coffee, sugar, salt. Hardtack biscuits, those flat, flavorless squares of baked flour and water that will last for years, but taste like eating wood. The wagon groans under the weight of it all, plus your tools, your clothes, perhaps a few precious items from home, a Bible, a quilt, a small trunk of keepsakes you cannot bear to leave behind. You will not ride in this wagon. Almost no one does. The wagon is for supplies, not passengers. You will walk. Every day for months, you will walk beside it while it creaks and sways along the rutted path ahead. 15 miles a day, if conditions are good. 12 if they are not. The arithmetic is simple and unforgiving. 2,000 miles divided by 15 miles per day equals 133 days of walking. More than 4 months if nothing goes wrong. And things always go wrong. The wagon train departs in late April or early May, when the prairie grass is high enough to feed the oxen and mules, but early enough to cross the mountains before winter closes the passes. You travel in a company of 25 wagons, perhaps more. There is a captain, elected by the group, who makes decisions about when to rest, where to camp, which route to take when the trail branches. There are rules agreed upon before departure. No travel on Sundays. Stay together. Help one another. The first days are almost pleasant. The weather is mild, the grass green, the sense of adventure still bright and untarnished. Children run alongside the wagons, laughing. Women walk together, chatting, their skirts gathering dust. Men drive the oxen forward with steady calls and occasional prods. The landscape of Missouri and Kansas rolls gently beneath an endless sky, but the novelty fades quickly. Your feet develop blisters that burst and bleed and form calluses. Your legs ache, The sun beats down, relentless, and there is no shade. The dust is everywhere in your hair, your clothes, your food, your lungs. When wagons travel close together, the dust becomes choking, unbearable, and some trains begin to spread out across miles of terrain, each seeking cleaner air. But this creates other problems. Stragglers fall behind. Families become separated. Arguments erupt over the pace, the route, whose turn it is to lead and eat dust, and whose turn to follow. If you are a woman, the work is ceaseless. You wake before dawn to build a fire, prepare breakfast bacon fried in a pan over an open flame, coffee boiled in a kettle, perhaps some beans if they were soaked overnight. The children must be dressed, their faces washed with water, hauled from a nearby creek. Then the walking begins, 15 miles of it, while you keep an eye on the children, ensure none wander too far, lose themselves in the vastness. Midday brings a brief rest. Lunch is simple, often just hardtack and water, perhaps a bit of bacon. If it rains, there is no fire, and hardtack becomes the entire meal dry, tasteless, requiring coffee or water to soften it enough to chew. Then more walking, more dust. The children grow tired and fussy. You carry the smallest one, though your arms already ache from carrying them yesterday and the day before. Evening brings the illusion of rest, but the work merely changes form. The wagons circle for the night, forming a makeshift corral for the animals. You gather fuel for a fire, and here, on the open prairie where trees are scarce, that means walking the nearby area collecting dried buffalo dung buffalo chips, they are called. They burn surprisingly well when dry, producing a steady heat, though the smell takes some getting used to. You cook dinner, more bacon and beans, perhaps some bread if you have the energy and the flour to spare. You wash dishes with water that must be carefully rationed. You mend torn clothes, tend to blisters and cuts, settle the children for sleep in the cramped space beneath the wagon, or inside it if rain threatens. Men are spared the domestic labor, but carry their own burdens. They drive the wagons, manage the oxen, hunt for game when it can be found, stand watch at night against the unlikely but ever-present fear of theft or attack. They make repairs when wheels crack or axles break, improvising solutions with whatever materials are at hand. Both men and women help when a wagon becomes stuck in mud or sand, when a river must be crossed, when the trail itself must be cleared of rocks or felled trees. Gender roles persist, but bend under necessity. Women help push wagons. Men sometimes, though rarely, help with cooking when conditions demand it. Bacon, beans, hardtack, coffee. These are the foundations of your diet. Meal after meal, week after week. Bacon is eaten several times a day, fried until the grease runs clear, the meat tough and salty. One emigrant woman wrote in her journal, "One does like a change, and about the only change we have from bread and bacon is bacon and bread. The monotony wears on you. Your body begins to crave fresh food, vegetables, fruit, anything with color and moisture. When bacon spoils, as it inevitably does despite the smoking, it is dumped along the trail in greasy, stinking lumps. This brings a moment of relief, less weight in the wagon, but also anxiety, because bacon is a primary source of fat and protein. You make do with what remains. Beans, soaked overnight when water is available, boiled into a thick, tasteless mash. Hardtack, dipped in coffee to soften it, chewed until your jaw aches. Scurvy begins to creep into the wagon train. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruit means your body is starved of essential nutrients. Gums become spongy and bleed. Old wounds reopen. A pervasive fatigue settles into your bones, distinct from the exhaustion of walking. Some recognize the signs and brew tea from wild plant sagebrush, prairie grass, anything green. It helps sometimes, but the condition spreads regardless, another invisible burden carried westward. And then there is cholera. This is the great terror of the trail, the killer that stalks the wagon trains like an invisible predator. Cholera outbreaks swept through the routes between 1849 and 1855, killing thousands. The disease is merciless in its speed. A person can wake feeling perfectly well, develop agonizing cramps and diarrhea by midday, and be dead of dehydration by evening. If the victim survives the first 24 hours, the illness typically runs its course in 5 to 7 days. But many do not survive. There is no cure, no effective treatment. The sick are made as comfortable as possible, even water they cannot keep down, prayed over by those who still have faith. And then, often, they die. The body is wrapped in whatever cloth can be spared. A blanket, a quilt, sometimes nothing but the clothes they wore. A grave is dug, shallow and quick, because the wagon train cannot stop for long. The body is laid in the earth, covered with stones if any can be found to prevent animals from digging it up. A wooden cross is fashioned from a broken wagon board, the name and date scratched or burned into the wood. Sometimes there is a brief prayer. More often, there is simply silence. And then the train moves on because it must. You leave loved ones behind in these unmarked places. Husbands bury wives. Parents bury children. The graves stretch along the trail, one every 50 yards. Some historians estimate a ribbon of sorrow extending 2,000 miles across the prairie. Most graves are in Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, lost to time and weather. The wooden markers rotted away or blown down by wind. A few remain stone cairns or iron crosses, silent testimony to lives extinguished far from home. The rivers are another constant danger. The trail crosses dozens of them: the Kansas River, the Platte, the Snake, the Columbia. Some are shallow and easily forded. Others are deep, swift, treacherous. At major crossings, ferries operate during peak migration months. Crude rafts poled or pulled across by men who charge exorbitant fees. Many emigrants cannot afford the ferry and must ford the rivers themselves, driving their wagons into the current and praying the oxen keep their footing. Wagons overturn. The current catches them, tips them sideways, sends supplies floating downstream. People drown trying to save their possessions, or simply lose their grip and are swept away. Children fall from wagons, are pulled under before anyone can react. The crossings are terrifying, even when successful. The water rising to the wagon bed, the oxen bellowing in fear, the whole vehicle swaying as the current pushes against it. You walk beside the wagon, or sometimes sit inside it if you are small or frail, and feel the sickening lurch each time a wheel lifts off the riverbed. After the crossing, there is the grim task of accounting. Who made it? Who did not? Another grave is dug, if the body can be recovered. Another marker placed. The train moves on. As the weeks turn to months, as the oxen grow thinner and weaker from the exertion and poor forage, as the wheels crack and the axles strain under weight they were never designed to carry, difficult decisions must be made. The wagons are too heavy. The animals cannot pull them much farther. Possessions must be abandoned. You walk past furniture left beside the trail tables, chairs, stoves, trunks. Things people carried 200 miles, 500 miles, 1,000 miles before finally admitting they could go no farther. Sometimes you recognize items from families you traveled with, people who left them behind days ago and are now miles ahead. Sometimes the items are older, left by wagon trains from previous years, weathered and sun-bleached, but still recognizable. A child's toy, a woman's mirror, a man's anvil. Each one represents a small heartbreak, a piece of home relinquished to the indifferent prairie. Your own wagon must be lightened. You stand beside it, looking at your possessions, trying to decide what can be spared. The extra barrel of flour? The second set of clothes? The quilt your grandmother made? The one you swore you would keep forever? One by one, items are lifted out and placed beside the trail. You tell yourself someone else might find them useful. You tell yourself they are just things, and things do not matter. But they do matter, and leaving them feels like losing pieces of yourself. Months into the journey, the flat prairie gives way to rolling hills, then mountains. The Blue Mountains of Oregon loom ahead, forested and steep. Here, the trail must be cut by hand, trees felled and dragged aside, a road carved through timber so thick it blocks the sun. Every man in the train takes turns with an axe, chopping until their hands blister and bleed, their backs scream in protest. The wagons creep forward, mile by painful mile. Beyond the Blue Mountains lies the Dalles, where the trail ends at the Columbia River. Some emigrants load their wagons onto rafts and float the river, risking rapids and capsizing. Others take the newly built Barlow Road, a toll route around Mount Hood that is barely more than a rocky path. Either choice is dangerous. Either choice is exhausting. You are 4 months into the journey now, perhaps 5, and exhaustion is not just physical but existential. You move because stopping means dying. You place one foot in front of the other because you have come too far to turn back. And then, finally, the Willamette Valley. Green and fertile, ringed by mountains, watered by clear streams. This is the promised land, the reason you walked 2,000 miles, buried loved ones, abandoned treasures, endured suffering you will never fully be able to explain to those who are not there. You have arrived, but arrival is not triumph. You are exhausted, emaciated, often ill. Your clothes are rags. Your wagon is a wreck. Your supplies are nearly gone. Winter is coming, and you must build shelter, find food, somehow survive until spring, when you can plant crops on land you do not yet legally own. Some emigrants arrive to find help from earlier settlers, or from missionaries who provide food, clothing, shelter. Others find nothing, only wilderness and the slow realization that the hardest part may not be over. You will survive, most likely. Most do, or at least enough to build farms and towns, and eventually a state. But survival is not the same as prosperity, and the Oregon Trail has taken something from you. It can never be fully recovered months of your life, spent in exhausting motion, loved ones left in shallow graves, and innocence about the cost of ambition. The trail behind you stretches 2,000 miles, marked by graves, discarded possessions, and the ruts your wagon wheels cut into stone. You will never travel it again. You will spend the rest of your life in Oregon, and when you tell your children and grandchildren about the journey, you will soften it, make it bearable, turn suffering into adventure. But late at night, alone with your thoughts, you will remember the truth, the dust, the hunger, the graves, the endless, exhausting march westward. Segment 2, the California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855, a discovery that changed everything. Let us drift back now to a cold January morning in 1848, to a place called Coloma, nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. James Wilson Marshall, a carpenter and millwright, is inspecting the tail race of a sawmill he is building for John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who owns vast tracts of land in the Sacramento Valley. The mill needs water to power its saws, and Marshall has been digging a channel to divert flow from the nearby American River. As he walks the channel on the morning of January 24th, something catches his eye, a glint of metal in the shallow water. He reaches down, picks it up, feels its weight. His heart begins to pound. It made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold, he later recalled. He sees another piece, then another. Gold, not traces, not dust, but visible flakes and nuggets lying exposed in the stream. Marshall and Sutter attempt to keep the discovery secret. They understand, perhaps, what will happen when word spreads. But secrets of this magnitude cannot be contained. By May, rumors are circulating through San Francisco. By summer, the news has reached the East Coast. By autumn, newspapers around the world are printing stories of gold, vast quantities of it lying on the ground in California, free for the taking. And people begin to move, first in trickles, then in torrents, abandoning jobs, families, entire lives, driven westward by a dream of sudden, transformative wealth. The journey to California in 1849 offers three primary routes, each with its own perils and promises. If you live in the American heartland, Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, the Overland Trail is your most practical option. The same route we have already walked to Oregon, but now branching southwest from the Raft River in Idaho, angling toward the Humboldt River in Nevada, crossing deserts and mountain passes to reach the gold fields. You know what this journey entails. Months of walking, dust and hunger, graves beside the trail. If you live on the East Coast and have money for passage, you might choose the sea route around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. This is the longest route in distance, some 18,000 miles, but also the safest in some respects. You board a ship in New York or Boston, endure 6 months at sea, weathering storms in the Southern Ocean, battling seasickness that leaves you weak and miserable for weeks. Most passengers have never been on water before, and their diaries record the misery in vivid detail. The constant motion, the cramped quarters, the monotony of salt pork and hardtack, the terror of gales that send waves crashing over the deck. But eventually, finally, you round the Horn and sail north along the Pacific coast to San Francisco. You arrive exhausted, pale, thinner, but alive. The third route, the Panama shortcut, is faster but more dangerous. You sail from the east coast to Panama, disembark on the Atlantic side, cross the narrow isthmus by mule train through thick jungle infested with mosquitoes and disease, then board another ship on the Pacific side for the voyage north to California. The crossing takes only days rather than weeks, but malaria, yellow fever, and cholera lurk in the tropical heat. Many die in Panama, their bodies buried in shallow graves far from home, their gold-seeking dreams ended before they ever reach California. By 1849, the year that gives the 49ers their name, nearly 90,000 people pour into California. By 1855, more than 300,000 will have made the journey. It is one of the largest mass migrations in human history, driven by greed, desperation, and the intoxicating possibility that fortune might be found simply by bending down and plucking it from a riverbed. You arrive in California by trail, by ship, by sheer force of will, and make your way to the gold fields in the Sierra foothills. Towns had sprung up almost overnight. Ramshackle collections of tents and wooden shacks with names like Hangtown. Rough and ready, you bet, Murderer's Bar. These are not towns in any civilized sense. They are camps, temporary settlements lacking law, order, or any semblance of social structure beyond the crude rules miners impose upon themselves. Hangtown, later renamed Placerville to soften its brutal reputation, earns its nickname from the swift, violent justice dispensed there. In 1849, 5 men attempt to rob a Mexican gambler of his gold dust. 3 are caught, 2 Frenchmen and a Chilean. There is no police force, no jail, no formal court. A mob convenes a makeshift trial, finds the men guilty within minutes, and hangs them from a large oak tree on Main Street. The bodies swing for hours as a warning. Similar scenes play out across the gold fields: vigilante justice, lynchings, murders over disputed claims, or imagined slights. Life is cheap when gold is dear. You stake a claim along a creek or river, a small plot of land you will work until it is exhausted or until you are. If you are lucky, you arrived early, in 1848 or 1849, when gold could still be found lying on the surface or just beneath it. You might, in those first months, pan several ounces a day, enough to make you feel wealthy, vindicated in your journey. But those days pass quickly. By 1850, the easy gold is gone. Placer mining, the panning and sluicing that defines the early gold rush, is backbreaking, repetitive work. You crouch or kneel beside a stream, dipping your pan into the gravel and water, swirling it in precise motions that wash away the lighter sediment and leave, if you are fortunate, a few flakes or grains of gold at the bottom. Your back aches. Your knees scream in protest. The water is ice cold, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, and your hands go numb within minutes. You warm them over a fire, then return to the stream. Again, again, hour after hour, day after day. Some miners construct sluice boxes-long wooden troughs with ridges on the bottom to catch gold while water washes the gravel through. This allows you to process larger volumes, but it requires cooperation, capital, and constant labor. You shovel gravel into the sluice, divert water to flow through it, periodically stop to clean out the ridges and collect whatever gold has accumulated. The work is exhausting, the returns often meager. A good day might yield a quarter ounce of gold. A bad day yields nothing but sore muscles and a deepening sense of futility. By the early 1850s, hydraulic mining begins to dominate. Companies, not individual miners, bring water from higher elevations through canvas hoses, directing it through massive iron nozzles, called monitors, that blast hillsides with enough force to wash entire landscapes into sluices. The devastation is extraordinary. Entire hills disappear. Valleys fill with sediment. Rivers run thick with mud. The environmental damage will persist for generations. But in the moment, it is simply the cost of efficiency. Hydraulic mining processes gravel on a scale individual miners could never achieve, but it also ends the dream of the lone prospector making his fortune with a pan and a strong back. The gold rush, in its later years, becomes industrialized, controlled by companies with capital, leaving ordinary miners to work as wage laborers rather than independent fortune seekers. Gold might be abundant, but everything else is scarce, and scarcity drives prices to levels that seem almost absurd. Eggs, which cost a few cents per dozen in the East, sell for $3 per individual egg, in the mining camps roughly $90 in modern terms. A slice of bread costs $1. A pound of rice costs $8. Coffee, desperately craved by miners enduring cold mountain mornings, reaches $1,200 per pound in today's dollars. Even basic tools are exorbitantly expensive. A shovel costs $36, a gold pan $8, boots $6. These prices are not arbitrary. California in 1849 is isolated, difficult to reach, and producing almost no food or manufactured goods. Everything must be imported, either by ship around Cape Horn or by wagon across the continent. The cost of transportation, combined with explosive demand and limited supply, creates inflation unlike anything America has experienced before or since. Merchants, not miners, become wealthy. The men selling shovels and pans, the shopkeepers selling flour and bacon, the hotel owners charging exorbitant rates for a bed, or even a spot on the floor. These are the ones who prosper. The miners, for the most part, spend their days in frigid water, their backs bent, their hands raw, chasing a fortune that perpetually eludes them. You spend $8 on breakfast eggs, bread, coffee. You spend weeks earning an ounce of gold, worth $15 in 1849 prices. You spend it almost as quickly as you earn it, trapped in a cycle of labor and expenditure that enriches everyone but yourself. Some miners give up and return home. Others persist, convinced the next pan will be the one that changes everything. Most die poor, or poorer than when they arrived. The gold rush is not a story of opportunity extended equally. It is a story of violence, dispossession, and the brutal enforcement of racial hierarchy. California's Native American population, estimated at 150,000 in 1848, will be reduced to 30,000 by 1860, a catastrophe so swift and complete that modern historians classify it as genocide. Miners and settlers flood indigenous territories, destroying villages, polluting rivers, killing game. When Native Americans resist or simply exist in spaces white miners desire, they are hunted, massacred, driven into increasingly marginal lands where starvation and disease finish what bullets began. John Sutter himself, the man whose sawmills sparked the gold rush, enslaved hundreds of Native Americans as laborers, using rape and coercion to maintain control. When gold was discovered, some of Sutter's enslaved indigenous workers led Marshall to the site. Their knowledge exploited, their contributions erased from history. Within years, entire tribes and languages vanish, their last speakers dying alone, their names forgotten. Chinese immigrants face a different, but no less vicious form of violence. Arriving by the thousands from Hong Kong and southern China, they come seeking wages to send home to their families. They earn reputations as frugal, hard-working miners who take over abandoned claims and extract gold others missed. This earns them not respect, but resentment. American miners, convinced the Chinese are depriving them of wealth, attack them with impunity. Beatings, lynchings, even massacres occur regularly. The perpetrators face no consequences, no justice. Chinese men have their Q's traditional braided hairstyles cut off as a form of humiliation and assault. They are barred from certain mining districts, taxed heavily when allowed to work, treated as perpetual foreigners despite their labor and contributions. The gold rush, celebrated in myth as a democratic frontier where anyone could strike it rich, is in reality a space where power, violence, and racial hierarchy determine who prospers and who suffers. Most miners find little or nothing. The lucky few who arrived early might have panned a few $100s worth of gold before the easy deposits were exhausted. The rest spend months or years chasing rumors new strikes in distant valleys, rich veins supposedly just discovered, only to arrive and find the rumors false or the claims already taken. They move from camp to camp, always searching, always hoping, growing thinner, more desperate, more willing to believe the next story will be true. Some die in the gold fields from accidents, disease, violence, or simple exhaustion. Others abandon the search and return home, penniless, ashamed to face the families they left behind with such grand promises. A few remain in California, not as miners, but as laborers, farmers, shopkeepers, building the state that will emerge from the chaos of the gold rush. But these are not the stories told in legend. The legends remember only the success, the fortunes made, the gold pulled from the earth. The failures, far more numerous, are quietly forgotten. The landscape itself suffers. Rivers that once ran clear now flow thick with sediment from hydraulic mining. Hillsides collapse into valleys. Forests are stripped for timber to build sluices and mining camps. Fish populations collapse as spawning grounds are buried under mud. The damage will persist for decades, centuries, visible even today in the scarred foothills and sediment-choked waterways of the Sierra Nevada. This destruction is not accidental. It is the inevitable consequence of mining on an industrial scale, of treating the land not as a place to live, but as a resource to exploit. The miners and companies extracting gold do not intend to stay, do not plan to build a future here. They want wealth, quickly, and they tear the landscape apart to get it. What remains after they leave is someone else's problem. By 1855, the gold rush is effectively over. The easy gold is gone. What remains requires industrial equipment, capital investment, corporate organization, things beyond the reach of individual miners. Some prospectors continue searching, always searching, but the mass migration has ended. California's population has exploded, its economy transformed, but the dream that drew hundreds of thousands west, the dream of bending down and picking up a fortune, has proven largely illusory. The real winners were the merchants, the bankers, the land speculators, the men who sold supplies and services to miners rather than mining themselves. They accumulated wealth steadily, year after year, while the miners gambled everything on the slim chance of a rich strike. This pattern will repeat throughout American history. Those who service dreams become wealthy, while the dreamers themselves go broke. Breathe slowly. Let the images of the gold fields fade. The cold water, the backbreaking labor, the desperate hope, all of it is long past. You are here in the present, in warmth and safety. The gold rush, for all its drama and mythology, was simply another chapter in the long human story of ambition, suffering, and the relentless pursuit of something just beyond reach. The landscape remembers. Long after the pioneers have vanished, after their wooden wagons rotted away and their canvas tents dissolved in the wind, the earth itself bears witness to their passage. Stand today at certain points along the Oregon Trail in Wyoming, Nebraska, Idaho, and you will see grooves carved into solid rock, channels worn so deep that you could stand in them and not see over the edges. These are the wagon ruts, and they are among the most tangible evidence of the great westward migration. Some measure 5 feet deep, cut into sandstone and limestone by decades of iron-rimmed wheels grinding over the same narrow path. At certain sites, particularly where the terrain forced wagons into narrow passages, the ruts reach 6 feet in depth deeper than a tall person. They were not carved by a single wagon, or even 100. They represent the cumulative weight of hundreds of thousands of travelers, year after year, following the same route because the landscape offered no better alternative. At a place called Guernsey, Wyoming, the trail descends into a rocky ravine, and here, the ruts are particularly impressive multiple parallel channels where wagons spread out when space allowed, then converged again into a single deep groove where the passage narrowed. Walk through them today, and you can still feel the history pressing in, the sheer physical effort represented by these scars in stone. Every inch was earned with the labor of oxen straining against yokes, with emigrants walking beside wagons, guiding them down slopes, racing them on climbs. At Virtue Flat in Oregon, near Baker City, 7 miles of visible ruts stretch across the landscape. And here you can see something remarkable: parallel tracks, implying that some wagons passed others, creating what might be the American West's first passing lanes. Imagine the urgency, the competition to reach water sources first, to claim the best campsites. Even in the midst of communal migration, individual needs and frustrations asserted themselves. These ruts remain visible more than 150 years later because the landscape preserves them. In wetter climates, vegetation would have covered them. Erosion would have softened them. But on the dry plains and desert plateaus of the West, change happens slowly. The earth remembers what was done to it. Walk the trail today, particularly in remote sections far from roads and development, and you will still find remnants of the pioneer migration scattered across the ground. Not everywhere, not in great quantities, but enough. Rusted nails, fragments of wagon wheels, shards of pottery. Occasionally, with permission and under proper archaeological supervision, enthusiasts with metal detectors find more substantial artifacts: horseshoes, tools, belt buckles, coins. But the most striking evidence of the trail is not what was lost accidentally, but what was abandoned deliberately. As we have already discussed, emigrants were forced to lighten their loads when their animals weakened, when the terrain grew too difficult, when the simple mathematics of weight versus distance became impossible to ignore. They left behind everything they could bear to part with, and eventually, things they could not bear to part with either. One traveler in 1849 recorded what he saw at a single abandoned campsite: 2 trunks, 2 boxes, 3 gold washers, a set of wagon hounds, about 10 bushels beans, a pile of coffee, another of rice, dried fruit, tools of different kinds, boots and shoes, and a variety of sundries. Another describes seeing quantities of bacon, flour, salt, beans, coffee, sugar, tools of every description, such as picks, spades, shovels, axes, saws, augers, chisels, planes and sea, gold washers and cooking stoves in abundance, log chains, powder, lead, and any number of guns, dry goods, law books, novels, and a little of everything else. Law books, novels. Someone carried these across hundreds of miles, believing they would be important in their new life, only to abandon them when survival demanded it. The pioneer experience is written not just in what they kept, but in what they could not keep. in the growing desperation represented by each discarded item. A trunk left at 50 miles might contain clothes. A trunk left at 500 miles might contain family heirlooms, irreplaceable treasures. The farther west, the more valuable the things abandoned, and the more wrenching the decision to leave them. Historian Merrill Matz noted the tragic irony of this pattern. Emigrants clung to their possessions until their animals gave out and threw everything away. They lost both their goods and the strength of their teams, arriving with almost nothing. Had they lightened loads earlier, more gradually, they might have preserved their animals' strength and reached their destinations with more intact. But foresight is difficult when every item represents a dream, a plan, a piece of home. The trail is lined with graves. Thousands of them, though most have long since vanished, the wooden markers rotted away, the stones scattered, the locations forgotten. Historians estimate that approximately 1 in 10 emigrants died on the journey, somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people over the decades of heavy migration. Most died of disease, particularly cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Others died from accidents falling from wagons, drowning in river crossings, accidental gunshots. The burials were necessarily hasty. When death came, the wagon train could not stop for long. A shallow grave was dug, often only a foot or two deep. The body was wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, sometimes sewn into a blanket. A brief prayer might be said, if the deceased's companions had the emotional capacity and time. Then the grave was filled in, and stones or logs were piled on top to prevent animals from digging up the corpse. Wolves, coyotes, and other scavengers had learned that wagon trains meant fresh graves, and they would dig them up with horrifying efficiency once the emigrants moved on. Markers, when they were made, consisted of wooden boards with names and dates carved or burned into them. Sometimes a date, sometimes just initials. Occasionally, a more elaborate marker, a carved headstone if someone in the company had the skill and tools, an iron cross if they could spare the metal. But wood rots, and the vast majority of trail graves have no markers now, their occupants nameless, their deaths marked only by the records in others' diaries. Modern archaeology has investigated some of these burial sites. Forensic analysis of remains reveals causes of death bone scarring from disease, fractures from accidents, malnutrition evident in tooth and bone development. These analyses confirm what diaries recorded. Death on the trail was common, quick, and often brutal. A child fell from a wagon tongue and was crushed by the wheels, dying instantly. A man drowned attempting to ford a river. A woman succumbed to cholera within hours of showing symptoms. The physical evidence matches the written accounts, each reinforcing the other, painting a picture of a journey that extracted a terrible price. In 1978, Congress designated the Oregon Trail as a National Historic Trail, recognizing its significance to American history and the need to preserve what remains. But preserving a 2,000-mile trail is extraordinarily complex. The National Park Service does not own most of the land the trail crosses. It relies on partnerships with the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, state agencies, tribal governments, and private landowners. Nonprofit organizations like the Oregon-California Trails Association, OCTA, play crucial roles, providing volunteers who mark trail routes, erect interpretive signs, and work with archaeologists to document sites. The challenge is that the trail passes through land now used for ranching, farming, mining, energy development, and housing. Wagon ruts have been plowed under to plant crops. Historic campsites have been covered by suburban developments. In one infamous case in the 1980s, an Oregon farmer plowed up a mile of ruts to plant potatoes, spurring the formation of OCTA when preservationists realized how quickly the trail was vanishing. Today, dedicated volunteers, often retirees with a passion for history, spend weeks each year walking the trail, using metal detectors under archaeological supervision to locate artifacts, documenting sites with GPS coordinates, advocating for preservation when development threatens historic sections. They are, in the words of one volunteer, a bunch of damn old folks that just like to go out and walk the ruts, but they recognize that without their efforts, the physical evidence of the Oregon Trail would disappear within a generation. The landscape itself is part of the trail's story, and this is what archaeologists emphasize when they speak about preservation. It is not just about saving ruts or artifacts. It is about preserving the experience, the long views that pioneers saw, the mountain passes they struggled over, the rock formations they described in their journals. When you stand at a preserved section of trail and look out across miles of sagebrush with mountains in the distance, you are seeing something very similar to what immigrants saw 170 years ago. This connection between place and experience is fragile. Build a power line across a historic viewshed and the connection is severed. Construct a highway near a trail segment and the silence, that immense, intimidating silence of the plains, is lost. Development does not just destroy physical evidence. It destroys the ability to imaginatively reconstruct the pioneer experience. Tribal perspectives are increasingly recognized as essential to understanding the trail's full history. For decades, interpretation focused almost exclusively on pioneer experiences, treating Native Americans as either obstacles or background elements. But the lands the immigrants crossed were and are indigenous homelands, occupied for thousands of years before wagons ever cut ruts into stone. The trail represented not opportunity but invasion, not heroism but tragedy, the beginning of dispossession, violence, and forced removal. Museums and interpretive centers are slowly incorporating these perspectives. The Tamist Cultural Institute in Oregon, for example, tells the story of the Oregon Trail from the perspective of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla peoples, emphasizing continuity rather than conquest. The walls near the end of the exhibit read, Nkun Wiziks, we are. The message is clear. Indigenous peoples were here long before the trail, and they remain, despite everything the trail represented and brought. There is a poignancy to the abandoned goods that still surface along the trail. Cast iron stoves so useful, so heavy, so impossible to carry farther. Books, law volumes, novels, Bibles, the intellectual life of home left beside the path because knowledge weighs too much when measured against survival. Tools, blacksmithing equipment, complete sets of carpenter's tools that would have been invaluable at the destination but could not be transported. Some emigrants tried to hide valuable items in marked graves, planning to return and retrieve them. Medical instruments, brandy, important documents, things too precious to abandon, but too heavy to carry. Did they ever return? The records do not say. Likely most did not, or could not, and their carefully cached treasures remain wherever they were hidden, if they remain at all. The artifacts that archaeologists recover tell stories written records often omit. The worn soles of boots reveal miles walked. The broken wagon parts show where loads became too much. The scattered buttons and fabric fragments indicate clothing worn to rags, then discarded. Material culture, the physical stuff of daily life, provides texture and detail that diaries, for all their value, cannot fully capture. It is possible, even now, to walk sections of the Oregon Trail that remain relatively pristine. The National Historic Oregon Trail Interpretive Center in Baker City, Oregon, sits on 500 acres of preserved trail landscape with visible ruts stretching for miles. You can stand in the grooves worn by wagon wheels, feel the hard stone beneath your feet, look out across the sagebrush-covered hills toward the mountains, and understand, in a visceral way, the immensity of what the emigrants undertook. There is comfort in this, strangely. The trail endures. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. Enough to remember. Enough to honor the lives lived and lost there. The landscape holds memory longer than we do, and in that holding, the past remains accessible, tangible, real. Breathe deeply. Feel yourself here in the present comfortable and safe. The trail is silent now, empty of wagons and footsteps. The graves are quiet. The abandoned goods have rusted away or been reclaimed by museums. What remains is the land itself, patient, enduring, marked by the passage of hundreds of thousands of people who walked westward into uncertainty, leaving traces we can still just barely see. In 1846, San Francisco, then called Yerba Buena, was a sleepy village of approximately 200 residents clustered around a natural harbor. There was a mission, a small military presidio, a handful of adobe structures, and vast emptiness stretching in every direction. 2 years later, when word of gold reached the settlement, something extraordinary happened. The town emptied. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores. Ships' crews deserted en masse. Even the schoolteacher left his classroom to search for gold. San Francisco became, briefly, a ghost town. But the emptiness did not last. By late 1848, prospectors were returning from the gold fields, not because they had struck it rich, but because they needed supplies, rest, a brief taste of civilization before returning to the mountains. Ships began arriving from the East Coast, from Latin America, from China, disgorging passengers desperate to reach the gold fields, but first needing food, equipment, a place to sleep. The population began to climb. 1,000 by the end of 1848, 25,000 by 1850, 36,000 by 1852. In 6 years, San Francisco transformed from a village into one of the largest cities in the western United States. This was not gradual urban growth. It was explosion, chaotic, violent, exhilarating, and deeply unstable. Buildings went up overnight, constructed of whatever materials could be found or imported. Tents crowded the hills. Wooden shacks lined muddy streets. There was no infrastructure, no planning, no order beyond what individuals could impose upon their immediate surroundings. Perhaps no image captures gold rush San Francisco better than the harbor choked with abandoned vessels. By June 1849 barely, a year after the discovery of gold, 200 ships sat deserted in the bay, their crews having fled to the gold fields within hours or days of arrival. By 1851, that number had swelled to 465 ships. Some still had a single watchman aboard. Most did not. The forest of masts created an eerie, surreal landscape proof of both the madness that gold inspired and the economic opportunities that abandonment created. Even naval vessels were not immune. The USS Ohio, a ship of the line, lost 18 sailors to desertion. Naval officers fumed, but there was little they could do. Men would risk court-martial, even execution, for the chance to find gold. The abandoned ships became a resource. Entrepreneurs converted them into warehouses, storing the flood of goods arriving daily from the east. Others became saloons, hotels, brothels, even a jail and a church. The Niantic, a whaling ship run aground, was transformed into a storehouse and hotel, its hull filled with merchandise, its deck converted into rooms. When the city later needed land for expansion, many ships were simply buried filled with rubble and covered over as the shoreline was extended 6 blocks into the bay. Today, when construction crews dig in San Francisco's financial district, they occasionally uncover the hulls of these vessels, preserved beneath streets and buildings, silent testimony to the city's strange birth. The labor shortage created by mass desertion gave rise to a new word in the American lexicon, to Shanghai. Ship captains desperate for crews paid crimps unscrupulous recruiters to kidnap sailors, render them unconscious with alcohol or drugs, and deliver them aboard vessels bound for distant ports. Men would wake at sea, already miles from shore, forced into service whether they consented or not. It was brutal, illegal, and utterly common in gold rush San Francisco. San Francisco burned. Again and again, with horrifying regularity, fires swept through the city, consuming hundreds of buildings in a matter of hours. The structures were almost entirely wooden, built quickly and cheaply to house the exploding population. They were packed close together, separated by narrow streets. Canvas tents and wooden shacks stood side by side with hastily constructed saloons and hotels. When fire started, it spread with terrifying speed. The first Great Fire occurred on Christmas Eve 1849, destroying much of the downtown. The second came on May 4, 1850, blamed on paroled Australian convicts, burning 300 buildings and causing $4 million in damage. The third fire struck just weeks later, on June 14, 1850, originating in a bakery and destroying another 300 buildings. The fourth fire came in September 1850, consuming 150 buildings. Each time, the city rebuilt, often within days. There was too much money at stake, too much opportunity, to allow fire to halt progress. But the pattern continued. In May 1851, the fifth and most devastating fire began in a paint shop. Citizens hoped that the city's new brick buildings would contain the blaze, but the heat was so intense that brick crumbled, iron doors and shutters expanded and warped, trapping people inside to burn to death. Over 1,500 houses were destroyed. At least 9 people died. The losses exceeded $12 million. A witness described the scene. The wind was unusually high, and the flames spread in a broad sheet over the town. All efforts to arrest them were useless. Houses were blown up and torn down in attempts to cut off communication. But the engines were driven back, step by step. As the wind increased to a gale, the fire became beyond control. The brick buildings on Montgomery crumbled before it. And before it was arrested, over 1,000 houses, many of which were filled with merchandise, were left in ashes. The city would burn and rebuild 6 times in 18 months. Each fire was a catastrophe. Each rebuilding was an opportunity. Those with capital to purchase brick, hire builders, secure prime locations, grew wealthier. Those without lost everything and often left San Francisco, defeated. While respectable merchants built their businesses south of Market Street, another San Francisco emerged along the waterfront, centered on Pacific Street. This district, named the Barbary Coast after the pirate-infested shores of North Africa, became synonymous with vice, violence, and unrestrained hedonism. The Barbary Coast was a 9-block area of dance halls, gambling houses, saloons, opium dens, and brothels. Pacific Street, the district's main thoroughfare, never closed. At any hour, day or night, one could find gambling tables surrounded by desperate men, bars serving rot-gut whiskey, and women selling whatever intimacy a sailor or miner could afford. The gambling was particularly notorious. At the El Dorado, a single card turn once decided $80,000. Liquor and female companionship were provided free by the house to encourage gambling. Paintings of nude women adorned the walls of even the better establishments. Prostitutes arriving by ship were sometimes auctioned directly from the decks, sold to the highest bidder. The brothels fell into 3 categories. The cow yards served as both apartment buildings and brothels, cheap and crowded. The cribs were the lowest establishments, barely more than shacks where the most desperate women serviced the poorest clients. The parlor houses catered to wealthier patrons, offering a veneer of respectability. Madame Bertha, who operated a parlor house on Sacramento Street, gave organ recitals on Sunday afternoons, her prostitutes singing popular songs while she accompanied. Police had little control over the district. San Francisco, as a port city with a transient population of sailors, miners, and fortune seekers, could not or would not regulate the activities that defined the Barbary Coast. The vice was, in a sense, tacitly accepted as necessary, a release valve for men who spent months in mining camps or at sea, who arrived in the city with gold dust and desperate hunger for pleasure. The absence of effective law enforcement created conditions ripe for vigilantism. In 1851, after a series of fires suspected to be arson and escalating crime, attributed to gangs called the Regulators, or Hounds, a group of citizens led by Sound Brennan formed the first San Francisco Vigilance Committee. They were primarily businessmen, men with property to protect and a stake in social order. The committee acted swiftly and brutally. Suspected criminals were captured, tried in makeshift courts with minimal due process, and sentenced within hours. Some were hanged. Others were whipped or deported. The committee operated outside the law, but with broad public support from those who believed the official authorities had failed to maintain order. In 1856, the committee reformed after a county supervisor named James P. Casey murdered newspaper editor James King. This second committee, led by William T. Coleman, was even more ambitious. They tried and executed Casey and Charles Cora, a notorious criminal. They barricaded streets, captured everyone within the cordon they judged criminal, and dispensed punishment as they saw fit. Opposition formed, a law and order faction composed of city officials and attorneys who recognized that vigilantism, however popular, undermined the rule of law. David S. Terry, a justice of the California Supreme Court, physically confronted vigilantes attempting an arrest, stabbing one of them in the ensuing struggle. He was imprisoned briefly, but never successfully tried. By late 1856, the committee disbanded, having lost public support. The vigilance committees declared their purpose was public safety, but their methods ignored fundamental principles of justice. Their trials lacked standard legal procedures. Their sentences were irreversible. They represented the triumph of mob rule over law, a darkness at the heart of Gold Rush San Francisco. While miners labored in mountain streams and gamblers lost fortunes on Pacific Street, a quieter but more permanent kind of wealth was being accumulated. The men who sold supplies to miners, not those who mined, became San Francisco's elite. 4 men, in particular Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Collis Huntington, and Charles Crocker, arrived in California during the gold rush and established themselves as merchants selling goods to prospectors. They did not search for gold. They sold shovels, pans, food, clothing necessities that miners needed and would pay exorbitant prices to obtain. Their profits were steady, reliable, compounding year after year. In the 1860s, these 4 men, later known as the Big Four, came together to head the Central Pacific Railroad, the company that would build the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. When the railroad was completed in 1869, they were among the wealthiest men in America. They moved to San Francisco, the financial epicenter of the West, and built enormous mansions atop a hill that would come to be known as Nob Hill. Their neighbors were other men who had grown rich not from gold, but from silver. James Flood and James Fair, both from poor Irish immigrant backgrounds, had discovered and exploited the Comstock lode in Nevada, the largest silver strike in American history, producing over $100 million in 20 years. They became known as the Silver Kings and built their own mansions on Nob Hill beside the railroad barons. These homes were staggering in their opulence, multi-story structures with ballrooms, libraries, conservatories, and servants' quarters. They represented the consolidation of gold rush wealth, the transformation of frontier fortune into dynastic power. When a cable car line was built to reach the top of the hill, financed, naturally, by Leland Stanford, Nob Hill became the address of choice for San Francisco's elite. After the 1906 earthquake and fire destroyed most of these mansions, they were replaced with grand hotels, the Fairmont, the Mark Hopkins, the Huntington, that still stand today. Flood's mansion, the only one to survive, became the Pacific Union Club, one of the most exclusive private clubs on the West Coast. The Big Four are gone, but the structures of wealth they created endure. Gold Rush San Francisco was, from the beginning, a profoundly international city. Chinese immigrants arrived by the thousands from Guangdong province, fleeing poverty and famine, seeking wages to send home to their families. Mexican and Chilean miners brought expertise and techniques developed in Latin American gold and silver mines. Europeans, Irish, Germans, Italians, French came seeking opportunity. By the 1850s, San Francisco had newspapers published in multiple languages, temples and churches representing diverse faiths, restaurants serving cuisines from around the world. This diversity created tension, particularly as economic competition intensified. Chinese miners faced violent discrimination. Irish and German workers competed for jobs in a city where labor demand fluctuated wildly. But the cosmopolitanism also created a vibrancy, a cultural richness that distinguished San Francisco from other American cities. Theaters hosted famous performers touring from the East and Europe. Hotels offered luxuries that rivaled establishments in New York or London. Restaurants served elaborate meals to patrons flush with gold dust or merchant profits. San Francisco was no longer a frontier town. It was a metropolis, chaotic, violent, unequal, but undeniably a city built in less than a decade from almost nothing. By the 1860s, San Francisco bore little resemblance to the village of 1846. The population had grown 100-fold. Wooden shacks had been replaced by brick buildings. Streets had been graded and paved. Gas lamps illuminated downtown thoroughfares. Cable cars climbed the steep hills. Victorian mansions crowned Nob Hill, while immigrant families crowded into tenements in the flatlands. The gold rush had ended, but the city it created persisted. The merchants who sold to miners had become bankers and industrialists. The prostitutes of the Barbary Coast had been joined by legitimate theaters and concert halls. The vigilantes had given way to a professional police force, however corrupt. San Francisco was no longer a temporary camp waiting for the gold to run out. It was a permanent fixture, the economic and cultural capital of the West. The lesson was clear, written in the city's rapid rise. Those who service dreams become wealthy, while the dreamers go broke. The miners, for the most part, found little. The merchants who supplied them built empires. It was ever thus, and San Francisco stood as monument to this truth. City built not on gold, but on selling the hope of gold to those who would never find it. The journey is complete. We have walked the Oregon Trail, endured its hardships, buried loved ones beside the path. We have watched miners pan for gold in ice-cold streams, chasing fortunes that mostly eluded them. We have stood in wagon ruts carved into stone, touched artifacts abandoned by desperate immigrants. We have entered San Francisco at its moment of transformation, witnessed its fires and its violence, its wealth and its squalor. These were lives lived at the edge of human endurance, in pursuit of dreams that rarely materialized as hoped. The emigrants who reached Oregon found not paradise, but hard work clearing land, building cabins, surviving winters with limited supplies. The miners who reached California found not easy wealth, but backbreaking. Labor and prices so inflated that even those who found gold remained poor. The merchants and bankers who never touched a gold pan became the true beneficiaries, their steady profits compounding into dynastic fortunes. And yet, they came. Hundreds of thousands of them, driven by desperation or hope, or simply the human need to believe that life could be different, better elsewhere. They transformed the American West, built cities and states, created infrastructure that endures. They also displaced indigenous peoples, devastated environments, perpetuated violence and discrimination. The legacy is complicated, neither purely heroic nor purely tragic, but deeply human in its mixture of ambition and cruelty, hope and suffering. You are here now, in the present, far removed from those dusty trails and muddy streets. The world they built has become the world you inhabit, its echoes still present in the geography they traversed, the cities they founded, the stories they left behind. But you are safe. The trail is quiet. The gold fields are silent. The fires have long since burned out. Rest. Let the weight of history settle gently around you. Let your breathing slow and deepen. The past asks nothing of you except remembrance, and even that can wait until morning. For now, simply be here, comfortable and still, as the night deepens and the stories fade into the darkness that cradles all things. Sleep well.